So, you've decided to show up now? Grandma's voice was icy, a far cry from the warm, soothing tone that had been my comfort as a child. Grandma, what's going on? I stammered, my words spilling out in a rush as confusion clouded my mind. They told me you were in a nursing home. Stop, she interrupted, raising her hand. That simple gesture felt as though it carried the weight of years of disappointment. Your grandfather tried calling you over and over, she continued, her voice trembling with barely contained emotion. He asked for you on his deathbed. All he wanted was to say goodbye to his little scientist. And yet you never answered. You never came. How? How could you be so heartless, Sharon? Let me see the number he was using to call, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady as the enormity of her words sank in. Please, Grandma. I need to understand what happened. Grandma disappeared into the house for a moment before returning, holding a small, weathered notepad in her unsteady hands. Scribbled on it, in Grandpa's familiar handwriting, was a phone number I didn't recognize. That's not my number, I murmured, staring at the digits as if they were some cruel joke. I've had the same number since high school. Did someone give you the wrong one? What do you mean, the wrong number? She asked, her stern demeanor beginning to falter. Your parents told us you changed it when you left for university, she said, her voice softening slightly. They said you didn't want anything to do with us anymore. A sinking feeling gripped me as the puzzle pieces began to fit together. Grandma, I came home during my break. Helen was here. She wouldn't let me in. She said no one was home. Later, Mom and Dad told me you and Grandpa were in a nursing home. Grandma's face turned ghostly pale. A nursing home? Her voice wavered, and her hands began to shake. We never. Her words broke off as she seemed to process the implications. Helen and your parents told us you were too busy with your new life at university to bother visiting, she said, her voice cracking with sorrow. They said you were ashamed of us, that we weren't good enough for you anymore. What? I gasped, my legs nearly giving out as I clung to the porch railing for support. And the funeral? I began, my voice faltering. They told me it was at 2 p.m. today. But when I got to the church, it was already over. They said I must have mixed up the times. But I didn't. I would never. The funeral was at 10 a.m., Grandma said slowly, realization dawning on her face. Your parents stood in front of everyone and told them how ashamed they were that you didn't come. Helen was crying, saying how hard she tried to reach you. Tears blurred my vision as the crushing weight of betrayal and regret overwhelmed me. I fell into Grandma's arms, both of us crying uncontrollably on the porch, letting out years of pain and confusion. He thought I abandoned him, I sobbed, my voice breaking as I clung to her. Grandpa died thinking I didn't care. Grandma stroked my hair gently, just as she used to when I was little, her own tears streaming down her cheeks. We know the truth now, sweetheart, she whispered, her voice filled with both sorrow and comfort. We know. After we had composed ourselves, Grandma reached for the phone. Her hands trembled slightly as she dialed, but her voice was firm and unwavering. Karen, it's me, she said calmly. I need you, Michael, and Helen to come over immediately. There are some important matters regarding paperwork we need to address. No, this can't wait. When she ended the call, she turned to me with a determined look in her eyes. They'll be here in an hour, she said firmly. The lawyer is on his way as well. When the doorbell rang, Grandma gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. Stay in the kitchen until I call you, she instructed. I waited quietly, listening to the muffled sounds of their arrival. Mom's polished laugh echoed through the hallway, Dad's voice carried a rehearsed tone, and Helen's bored sigh was unmistakable. Then Grandma's voice cut through, sharp and authoritative. Please, everyone have a seat. Mr. William is here to go over Thomas's will. That was my signal. I stepped into the living room just as the lawyer began opening his briefcase. The expressions on their faces when they saw me were priceless. Mom's smile froze mid-pose, Dad's face drained of all color, and Helen's mouth fell open in disbelief. Mr. William cleared his throat, breaking the awkward silence. Thomas Walker, being of sound mind, declare this to be my final will and testament, he began. The room went silent, save for the sound of rustling papers. The house and a generous fund for Grandma's care were addressed first. Then came the revelation that made Helen's face turn beet red with anger. To my granddaughter, Sharon Walker, I leave my newly constructed laboratory at 1550 Pine Street, fully equipped and ready for her to continue her research. All permits and necessary documents have been finalized. I stood there, stunned. Grandpa had built me a lab, a complete, functioning facility just for my work. Mr. William continued, the remainder of the estate is to be divided equally between my granddaughters, Sharon and Helen Walker. Helen shot to her feet, her chair screeching against the floor as her face twisted with rage. But before she could unleash her fury, Grandma raised a hand to silence her. There's something else, Grandma said, retrieving a folded letter. Your grandfather wanted this to be read as well. She unfolded the paper carefully, her voice softening as she began to read. My heart raced, memories of Grandpa rushing back. Where do you want this one, Grandpa? I used to ask every time I brought home another certificate or trophy. In the box with the rest, he'd reply with pride, referring to the special box I kept under my bed. I had never displayed my awards, not because I wasn't proud of them, but because I knew they made my parents uncomfortable. Helen, of course, always had her own commentary. Nobody likes a know-it-all, she'd say with a sneer. But Helen had no problem asking for my help when it came to her science homework, or, more accurately, demanding that I just do it for her. Helen, that's cheating, I'd protest, watching as she blatantly copied my work. Sharon, help your sister right now, Mom would snap, her tone brooking no argument. Family helps family. And just like that, I'd find myself doing Helen's homework, feeling like a fraud. Yet, no matter how much I hated it, standing up to my parents felt impossible. It was a cycle that played on repeat. Helen would demand, my parents would reinforce it, and I'd obey. Resentment bubbled inside me, but what choice did I have? Sometimes, I'd overhear my parents' conversations when they assumed I wasn't listening. Their muted voices floated up the stairs to my room, where I'd be immersed in my chemistry set or absorbed in the latest scientific journal. I just don't understand where she gets it from, Mom would say in frustration. No one else in our family is like this. Maybe she was switched at birth, Dad would joke, but his chuckle carried an undertone of truth that hurt more than if he'd outright admitted I was a mystery to them. One evening, after I'd won yet another science competition, I overheard Dad talking to Helen in his study. Her grades had been slipping, and the frustration in his voice was palpable. It's not fair that she's so smart, Helen complained bitterly. Sweetheart, Dad said, his tone softening. We need to focus on you. Sharon, well, she'll be fine on her own. Standing outside the door, I pressed my back against the wall, fists clenched, willing the tears not to fall. They were convincing themselves that their neglect was logical, as if my achievements somehow meant I didn't need their care or support. At school, I was the odd girl who spent her lunch breaks in the lab instead of the cafeteria. Sure, classmates came to me when they needed help with science homework, but true friendships were rare. The only people who truly saw and accepted me were Grandma and Grandpa. They were my safe haven. Look what I found for you, Grandpa would say with a warm smile, holding out a stack of science magazines or a new gadget for my experiments. I thought you'd find this interesting. With them, I was never too much or too different. They listened, encouraged, and celebrated every victory, no matter how small. Even with their unwavering support, the void left by my parents' indifference loomed large. At school events, I'd watch other parents beam with pride as they hugged their kids, or see siblings cheering each other on, and feel an ache deep in my chest. Then came the moment that shifted everything. At just 16 years old, I had completed all my high school requirements and earned a full scholarship to one of the most prestigious universities in the country. Graduation was supposed to be a moment of triumph, but instead, it was bittersweet. a reminder of everything I had achieved without the encouragement I craved from my own family. The day I left for university felt like the first time I could truly breathe. The campus was buzzing with energy, filled with people who shared my curiosity and passion. For once, I wasn't the outsider. In my advanced chemistry class, I met Sarah and Michael, two brilliant minds who lit up at the mere mention of molecular structures. For the first time in my life, I had friends who genuinely understood me. We'd spend countless hours in the lab, brainstorming ideas, laughing at our spectacularly failed experiments, and celebrating breakthroughs that would make most people's eyes glaze over. It was everything I had ever dreamed of, a place where I finally belonged. Yet, no matter how much I thrived, a part of me still longed for my family's validation. Every week, I'd call home, clinging to the hope of a deeper connection. "Yes, Sharon, that's nice," Mom would say dismissively whenever I tried to share my excitement about my research. And without fail, the conversation would shift. "Oh, did you hear about Helen's new job? She's working at that chic boutique downtown." It was as though my accomplishments didn't matter, as if I were invisible in their eyes. Their indifference stung, even as I told myself I didn't need their approval. I didn't realize at the time, but my idyllic university life was the calm before the storm. It all unraveled during one of my routine calls home. I was midway through my second semester, completely absorbed in my latest research project, when something in Mom's tone caught my attention. "And with your father's condition getting worse," she said, her voice trailing off, likely talking to Dad under the assumption I was on mute. "What about Grandpa?" I interrupted, my chest tightening with anxiety. "Mom, what's wrong with him?" There was a pause, the kind that stretched too long to feel innocent. "Oh, Sharon," she said, her voice suddenly shifting to a lighter tone. "I didn't realize you were still on the line. It's nothing serious, just a minor health issue. He's already recovering." "I'm coming home," I said immediately, mentally mapping out the fastest route back. "I'll be there by tomorrow morning." No, don't be ridiculous," Mom snapped, her tone sharper than usual. "You need to focus on your studies. Helen is helping them. Everything's under control." Her words didn't sit right with me. There was something evasive in her tone, but I tried to push the unease aside, convincing myself I was overreacting. Still, the nagging doubt refused to leave. I picked up the phone and called Grandma right after. "Oh, yes, dear," Grandma said, her voice unusually detached. "Helen's been such a help. She visits often to check on your grandfather." "Helen? The sister who used to call visiting our grandparents the most boring thing ever?" Something about it didn't make sense. My instincts told me there was more to the story, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. 2 weeks later, I stood in front of my grandparents' familiar front door, my heart racing with both anticipation and dread. But instead of Grandma's warm smile, it was Helen who greeted me, or rather, blocked my way. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice laced with fake surprise as she leaned against the doorframe. "I came to see Grandma and Grandpa. How's he doing?" "They're not home," she replied quickly, a little too quickly. "Grandpa's sick." "Where could they have gone?" I asked, frowning. "I don't know, Sharon," she snapped, her tone growing sharper. "Just go away." Before I could respond, she started to close the door. "Wait," I protested, sticking my foot in the doorway. "Let me come in and wait for them." "No one's home," she shouted, slamming the door against my foot with enough force to make me stumble.
"God, you're so annoying."
"Just leave." Confused and hurt, I stepped back, watching as she slammed the door shut. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I pulled out my phone and tried calling Grandma, but the call went straight to voicemail. My chest tightened with worry. Grandma always kept her phone on for me. Always. The silence on the other end of the line was more alarming than Helen's hostility. With no other options, I decided to go to my parents' house. If anyone had answers, it had to be them. When I stepped into the kitchen, Mom and Dad turned to me, startled by my unexpected arrival. Dad's expression quickly shifted to one of irritation. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice clipped and impatient. I want to see Grandma and Grandpa, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. But they weren't home. Helen wouldn't let me in. Mom and Dad exchanged a quick look. Mom was the first to speak, her tone overly casual, as if trying too hard to sound unconcerned. Oh, sweetheart, she said lightly, though her eyes betrayed something deeper. We were going to tell you. Your grandparents are in a nursing home now. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach.
What?
I managed to say, barely able to get the word out.
Why didn't anyone tell me?
It was a last-minute decision, Dad said smoothly, as if rehearsed. They needed specialized care. It's better this way. Which nursing home? I demanded, my voice rising with anger and panic. I want to visit them. They're under quarantine right now, Mom replied quickly, her words spilling out in a rush. No visitors allowed. Maybe next time. I opened my mouth to argue, to demand answers, but the calm, practiced way they both spoke made me feel as though I was slamming against an unbreakable wall. Something was being hidden from me. I could feel it. But I didn't know how to break through their lies. Returning to university didn't bring me the peace I hoped for. The events of that afternoon clung to me like a shadow. I couldn't shake the image of Helen's confrontational glare, my parents' disturbingly smooth explanations, or the feeling of being shut out, both literally and figuratively. Then came the phone call. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was in the middle of conducting an experiment. The steady hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed unusually loud as my phone buzzed on the counter. Mom's name flashed on the screen, and my stomach dropped. Something about the timing felt wrong. Sharon, Mom said, her voice flat, devoid of any emotion. Your grandfather passed away last night. The test tube in my hand slipped through my fingers, shattering against the lab floor. The sharp crack of breaking glass echoed like a gunshot, but it barely registered.
What?
I whispered, the word barely audible. No.
No.
Her voice remained disturbingly calm, almost rehearsed. The funeral is Thursday at 2 p.m. Don't be late. I couldn't respond. My chest felt tight, my throat closing in around unshed tears. I left the broken glass on the floor and stumbled out of the lab, the grief and confusion crashing over me in waves. Grandpa was gone. The man who had always believed in me, who celebrated my every accomplishment, who listened to my dreams like they were treasures. He was gone. And I hadn't even had the chance to say goodbye. The memories of him consumed me on the journey home. His warm smile, the way his eyes lit up when I told him about my experiments, and his constant encouragement all played on an endless loop in my mind. On Thursday, I arrived at the church at 1:30 p.m., determined to honor his memory. But as I pulled into the parking lot, an eerie emptiness greeted me. Not a single car was in sight. Confused, I made my way to the entrance, each step feeling heavier than the last. Inside, the faint smell of cleaning products hung in the air as a custodian mopped the floor. The Walker funeral? I asked, my voice trembling as I struggled to keep it steady. The man paused, frowning as he looked up. That ended hours ago. They held it at 10 a.m. The world seemed to spin as the words sank in. My knees buckled, and I grabbed onto a nearby pew to steady myself. How could this be happening? My parents had lied, again. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call them, to demand answers, to understand why they would keep me away from saying goodbye to Grandpa one final time. Oh, Sharon. Mom's voice stripped with mock disappointment when she answered my call. You must have confused the times. We clearly told you 10 a.m. No, I said, my voice trembling with anger and grief. My hand shook so badly, I could barely hold the phone steady. You said 2 p.m. I wrote it down. I know what I heard. Dad's voice cut in, calm and calculated. Your grandmother is still in the nursing home, he said smoothly. She doesn't want to see you right now. She's very upset that you missed the funeral. Every word felt like a stab, sharp and deliberate. I was too shaken to argue further. Desperate for answers and overwhelmed by their betrayal, I mumbled something about heading back to university. But my instincts had other plans. Before I knew it, I was driving to my grandparents' house. The familiar street felt like a lifeline. The old oak tree still stood tall. The garden was just as perfectly tended as ever, and Grandma's cherished wind chimes swayed gently in the breeze. My hands trembled as I rang the doorbell, my heart pounding against my ribcage. For a moment, there was silence. Then the door opened. There she was.
Grandma.
The same grandma who was supposedly in a nursing home and too upset to see me. Relief flooded my chest, and I moved to embrace her. But she took a step back. The look in her eyes stopped me cold. Her face was unfamiliar, hard and guarded. Her eyes, once filled with warmth and understanding, now stared at me like I was a stranger. "Grandma," I whispered, but the word felt hollow in the cold space between us. I couldn't comprehend the sharpness of her posture, the unrecognizable chill in her gaze. This wasn't the woman who had been my rock, my safe haven in a chaotic world. My mind flashed back to my childhood, a lifetime of being different. While Helen played with dolls and dreamed of castles, I was out in the yard with a magnifying lens, collecting leaves, rocks, and bugs to examine. "Mom, why do leaves change color and fall?" I'd ask, holding up a red maple leaf. "Ask your teacher, Sharon," Mom would reply dismissively, not even looking at me. "I'm busy helping Helen with her dance costume." That was my childhood, a stream of questions about the world met with disinterest or irritation. At 7, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by cups of liquids and baking soda, captivated by the fizzing reactions I was creating. "What are you doing?" Mom snapped, her voice breaking my focus. "Observe this," I said proudly, holding up the bubbling concoction. "Now clean it up," she barked. "I need the kitchen spotless." Helen's friends will be here soon for her birthday party. Helen's birthdays were always elaborate affairs with costumes, life-sized characters, and dozens of guests. Mine were quiet, just my grandparents and a plain cake. I never complained, but the disparity was glaring. "Here's your birthday present, sweetheart," Dad would say, handing me yet another encyclopedia. I loved the books, truly, but they couldn't distract me from the mountain of toys and gadgets Helen unwrapped at her celebrations. Even then, I understood where my parents' priorities lay. And now, standing in front of Grandma, her cold stare boring into me, it felt like my family had finally turned their backs on me for good. I'll always be grateful for my dad's parents, my grandparents. They were my sanctuary, the one place where I felt truly understood and accepted. Every weekend and school break, they greeted me with open arms and hearts. "Tell me all about what you've learned this week, little scientist," Grandpa would say, his eyes sparkling with genuine excitement as I eagerly shared my latest discoveries. His enthusiasm made me feel special in a way no one else could. With them, I wasn't too much or too different. I was celebrated for exactly who I was. Helen, on the other hand, never came along on those visits. "They're so boring," she'd whine. "Besides, Mom and Dad are taking me to the new theme park this weekend." I'd watch from the living room window as their car pulled out of the driveway without me, a mix of hurt and jealousy twisting in my chest. "Why can't I go too?" I asked once, my voice small and hesitant. "Oh, honey," Mom said absently, patting my head without looking at me. "You wouldn't have fun. You'd probably just want to learn how the rides work." That was my role in the family, the odd one out. I didn't fit the picture of what they wanted in a daughter. I was the curious child with too many questions, the one who preferred microscopes and experiments over makeup and mall trips. Helen, on the other hand, was everything they wanted, a typical girl with conventional interests. Everything changed when I started middle school. For the first time, someone outside of my grandparents saw me for who I truly was. That someone was my science teacher, Mrs. Peterson. "Mr. and Mrs. Walker, your daughter has extraordinary potential," she said during a parent-teacher meeting. I sat just outside the classroom, straining to hear every word. I've never seen a student grasp advanced scientific concepts so naturally. She should be moved into the gifted program. Mom's disapproval was evident in her tone. That sounds like a lot of work, she said dismissively. She's fine where she is. And we need to think about Helen. Sharon doesn't need special treatment. My heart sank. I knew exactly what was coming. They were going to say no, just like they always did when it came to anything about me. But then Grandma found out. The very next day, she marched into my school like a force of nature, her determination palpable. She stormed into the principal's office, her voice steady and firm. My granddaughter will take those exams and have every opportunity she's earned, Grandma declared, her tone leaving no room for argument. I don't care what her parents think. The principal hesitated, caught off guard by her intensity. But, Mrs. Walker, we need parental consent. My son and his wife will answer to me. Grandma cut him off sharply. Your job is to make sure Sharon gets her chance. And somehow, Grandma made it happen. She gave me the opportunity my parents never would have, proving once again that she was my fiercest advocate. After a week of heated arguments, and, I suspect, some financial persuasion from my grandparents, my parents reluctantly agreed to let me take the placement tests. I aced every single one. That was the beginning of a transformation I hadn't dared to dream of. The gifted program introduced me to international science competitions, academic Olympiads, and research seminars. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who thought like me, who shared my passions and understood my excitement. It was as though I had finally found where I belonged. My first international competition project focused on sustainable ecosystems, and I won. That win sparked something in me, a fire I couldn't extinguish. Competition after competition followed, and with each victory, I poured more of myself into my work. I had found my purpose, and it felt incredible. I'll never forget the moment around Grandma's dining table when the truth shattered the fragile facade of my family. Grandma stood tall, holding Grandpa's letter in her hands, her voice firm and unyielding. To my son and daughter-in-law, she began, reading aloud, your treatment of your daughters has been shameful. Each child deserves equal love and support, yet favoritism has poisoned this family. Stop, Helen shrieked, leaping to her feet. This is ridiculous. Why should she get anything? Her outburst stunned everyone. She turned on our parents, her voice climbing to a shrill pitch. You promised. She spat, her tone laced with venom. You said if I played nice, if I visited him and acted like the perfect granddaughter, everything would be mine. You made me grovel to a dying man. Her words hung in the air, raw and ugly, exposing the truth of her motivations. Helen wasn't mourning Grandpa. She was furious her performance hadn't earned her the reward she'd expected. And now what? She continued, her voice rising with fury. Little Miss Perfect gets a whole lab, and I'm stuck with half the money? No. Give me the house. She doesn't need both. She can keep her stupid lab. I stayed silent, watching as my sister's carefully constructed facade crumbled, leaving behind nothing but anger and entitlement. Finally, Mom broke the silence, her voice sharp and calculated. Sharon, she said, fixing me with a hard stare. You heard your sister. Be reasonable. Do you have any idea how much we've sacrificed for your education? All those science camps, competitions. I almost laughed at the absurdity of her claim. You didn't pay for any of that, I said quietly. Grandma and Grandpa did. That's not the point, Mom snapped, her composure cracking. Family means sacrifice. If you really want to honor your grandfather's memory, you'll sign over your share to Helen. She needs it more than you do. Honor his memory? Grandma's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. She rose from her seat, still clutching Grandpa's letter. Let me remind you exactly what Thomas had to say about this family's idea of sacrifice, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. She began reading again, her tone unwavering. To my son and his wife, your blatant favoritism has created poison in this family. Your treatment of Sharon has been nothing short of emotional abuse, while you've turned Helen into an entitled, spoiled. How dare you? Helen shrieked, her face red with fury. No, how dare you? Grandma thundered, her voice filled with righteous anger. You lied to and manipulated a dying man, and now you have the audacity to talk about sacrifice and family? With that, Grandma stormed to the door, throwing it open with force. Leave, she commanded, her voice trembling but resolute. All of you. I'm only sorry Thomas left you anything at all. Helen, you are nothing but a pampered, self-centered daughter who learned her behavior from your equally pampered, self-centered parents. The sound of slamming doors and shouted threats filled the air as they left, their anger and indignation echoing through the house. Then, silence fell, a heavy, almost sacred quiet. It was as though the house itself was breathing a sigh of relief, finally free of the toxicity that had lingered there for too long. It's been 5 years since that day. The research facility Grandpa built for me has become my home, my sanctuary. It's everything I could have ever dreamed of and more. Late at night, when the lab is quiet and the hum of the equipment fills the air, I sometimes feel his presence. It's not just a memory. It's as if he's there with me, his spirit radiating pride, love, and encouragement. Grandma is a frequent visitor. Her curiosity is as sharp as ever, and she loves asking about my latest projects. Recently, she started taking community college science courses, claiming they help her understand my work. But I know the truth. She just wants to share in the joy that Grandpa and I always had. She's my partner in discovery, and her support never wavers. As for Helen and my parents, I haven't spoken to them since that day. Their names occasionally flash on my phone or appear in my inbox, but I delete the messages without opening them. They made their choice, and I made mine. The other day, while organizing Grandpa's books, I came across an old photograph tucked between the pages. It was of me as a child, peering through a magnifying lens in Grandpa's yard while he pointed something out. The memory it captured felt alive, vivid and warm. On the back of the photo, in Grandpa's familiar handwriting, were the words, "My little scientist will change the world someday." Now, that photo sits on my desk, a daily reminder of who I am and where I come from. It reminds me that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who believe in you, who love you for who you are, and who celebrate your uniqueness instead of trying to stifle it. Grandpa and Grandma taught me that. They were my family in every way that mattered. And as I continue to chase the dreams they nurtured, I carry their love and belief in me every step of the way.